And the Oscar goes to Leonardo DiCaprio.
On February 28, 2016, at the 88th Academy Awards, Leonardo DiCaprio finally won his long-awaited Oscar for his performance in The Revenant, which stands today as his only win at the ceremony. But is it his best career performance? Well, I wanted to find out. In this video, I will be ranking all of DiCaprio's most notable performances. I'll be judging this based on where he was nominated for awards. I'm only including SAG, but not Ensemble Awards, BAFTA, the Critics' Choice and the Super Awards, the Golden Globe, and of course, the Oscars. By this definition, we have 15 performances to rank, most of which I have actually never seen before. So as I went through and watched all these films, I reviewed them on my letterbox, so you can check that out in the description, or just see it here. But without further ado, I hope you enjoyed the video. Now let's get started with number 15. In last place, we have a little film called Blood Diamond from the year 2006. And when it comes to this film, I was basically just confused from the start, to be honest. Going into it, I knew that Leo had been nominated basically everywhere for this performance, at the Oscars, at SAG, at the Golden Globes, at the Critics' Choice, so I was expecting something, something pretty big, right? And instead, for large parts of the first half, it honestly felt more like I was watching an action film than the prestige drama I was expecting, right? It kind of felt like a Fast and Furious film, I'm not gonna lie. The film opens up with all this chaos, civil war, child soldiers, violence, and it's intense. But when Leo finally shows up as Danny Archer, I wasn't fully convinced, and the main reason for that is the accent.
That's for breaking my TV, bro.
Now, to be fair to him, he said this was, quote, probably the most difficult accent I've ever had to do. I wouldn't have been able to identify one before I got there. It sounded like a hybrid between New Zealand and England. And you can kind of feel that. Because the accent never fully settles. It slips in and out, and at times it honestly took me out of the performance more than added to it. And that's the big issue, and so much of the character relies on that voice and presence. And beyond that, especially in the first half, Danny feels more functional than character-driven. A lot of it is reactive, moving from place to place, dealing with situations, but not really driving anything emotionally. Which is strange, because when you hear Leo talk about the character, there's actually a lot going on underneath the surface. He described Danny as a, quote, ex-mercenary, very disillusioned with Africa, someone who harbours a lot of ghosts from what he's seen. And even more interestingly, he said the character is, quote, in a constant state of denial, fighting not to feel anything about the place he's from. And you do get glimpses of that. At certain points, especially in the second half, that idea starts to come through more clearly. The film slows down a bit, becomes more focused, and you start to see more depth in the performance. Scenes with Jennifer Connelly's character help a lot with that. There's a late night conversation where he opens up slightly and you can see what he was going for. It's more controlled, more internal, and for a moment it works. There are flashes where the performance clicks, the way he carries himself physically, the slight menace in certain line deliveries, like that baboon story he tells. That's probably one of the few moments where he feels fully locked in. But for me, it's just not consistent enough. Because for me, the performance just never really settles. Just as it starts to click, something pulls you back out of it again. And while it's not bad by any means, it just never really turns into something great. But the ending finally gives the character some emotional weight. There's something about the way his character goes out that finally gives the performance some emotional impact. And you finally see that emotional shift he talked about, where he can't stay detached anymore. But by that point, it's a bit too late to fully turn the performance around. So overall, compared to everything else on this list, this is the one that lands at the bottom. Not bad by any means, but definitely the least impressive performance we're going to be looking at here. So with that said, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio as Danny Archer and Blood Diamond a 6.5 out of 10. Coming in at number 14 and potentially controversially low is What's Eating Gilbert, Grape. And for me, this was actually one of the hardest performances to judge. And I think that's because it's such a specific kind of role. Here, Leo is playing Arnie, a character with a severe developmental disability, and I don't personally feel qualified to sit here and say whether it's completely accurate or not. So instead, I'm looking at it purely from an acting perspective. And straight away, what stands out is the level of commitment. This is a full-body performance. The voice, the movement, the energy, it never ever drops. It's completely transformative, and honestly almost unrecognisable compared to the actor that Leo would later become. DiCaprio himself described Arnie as a, quote, real instinctive character. Someone who doesn't think about consequences, only the immediate outcome of a situation. And you can really feel that in the performance. Everything feels reactive and immediate. There's no filter between impulse and action. At times, the performance is intentionally overwhelming. There's a lot of shouting, a lot of repetition, and there were moments where I questioned whether it might be slightly exaggerated. But when you look closer, it actually feels very intentional. The repetition, the unpredictability, the lack of self-awareness, it all comes across as a very specific set of choices rather than something unfocused. And where the performance really worked for me was in the emotional moments, especially towards the end. That's where you start to see more vulnerability, and it begins to feel less like a performance and more like a real person. There's a scene where Arnie reacts to the death of his mother, and that's probably where it clicked the most for me. It's still in character, still consistent with everything he's been doing, but there's something underneath that just feels really genuine to me. I also think it's important to remember just how young DiCaprio was. He was only bloody 18 when making this film. And the level of commitment he's showing in such a physically and emotionally demanding role is seriously impressive. And it's interesting looking back at his mindset at the time. When asked about the possibility of award recognition, he said, quote, "I'd love it, but I'm not going to expect it. You just deal with it if it comes." Which is mad to think about now, because this ended up being his first Oscar nomination, and now, decades later, he's got 7 acting nominations and a bloody win. So even though I'm not entirely sure how to judge the performance in terms of accuracy, I can absolutely recognise how difficult it is and how much he's putting into it. For me, it's not one of his absolute best performances, and I did find parts of it a bit overwhelming, but at the same time, the commitment, the transformation, and the emotional honesty really do stand out. So I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio as Arnie Grape in What's Eating Gilbert Grape a 7.5 out of 10. Coming in at number 13 is Don't Look Up. And honestly, this is probably the least memorable performance on the entire list. Not bad by any means, it just hasn't really stayed with me compared to the others. Leo plays Dr. Randall Mindy, a scientist trying to warn the world about an extinction-level comet heading towards Earth. And the entire performance is basically built around escalating panic. From the start, he feels completely out of his depth. He's awkward, twitchy, physically uncomfortable. You genuinely believe this is somebody completely unequipped for public attention. Leo actually said filming the TV studio scenes made him and Jennifer Lawrence feel like a, quote, couple of deer in headlights. And that energy really comes through. Leo also talked about watching real climate scientists trying to explain terrifying information in a way that, quote, doesn't bum people out too much. And that's basically the character. Someone trying to stay calm, stay professional, and slowly losing control. That's where the performance works best. Because when Randall finally snaps during the talk show scene, it lands. All the anxiety and frustration he's been suppressing suddenly spills out, and it's probably the standout acting moment in the film.
I think this whole administration has completely lost their fucking mind! And I think we're all gonna die!
But outside of that, I don't think the role gives DiCaprio enough material to fully elevate the performance. Compared to the performances higher up on this list, this feels lighter, less layered, and ultimately less memorable. He's still very good, but it never quite develops into one of his truly standout performances. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio in Don't Look Up as Dr. Randall Mindy comes in at number 13, and I'm giving the performance a 7.5 out of 10. We have Catch Me If You Can, which gives us a very different kind of Leo performance compared to a lot of the others on this list. Now, in fairness, you might hear me say that a few times, but this one's different to the other ones being different. Anyways, it doesn't matter. This is his only collaboration with legendary director Steven Spielberg, and overall it's a much lighter, more fun, sort of light-hearted sort of role. Leo plays Frank Abagnale Jr., a young con man forging checks and pretending to be pilots, doctors, lawyers, basically anything he thinks he can get away with. What makes this performance work is the duality that Leo is balancing. On the surface, he's confident, he's charming, he's smooth, he's got that boyish swagger that makes you understand why people believe him. But underneath that, there's always a bit of nervous energy. You can see that he's constantly on edge, constantly thinking, constantly trying not to get caught. There are a few moments, especially when he's dealing with Tom Hanks' character, where that confidence drops slightly and you get a glimpse of the fact that he's really just a kid in way over his head. And I think that's what stops the performance from becoming smug. Frank enjoys the fantasy of being these people, but Leo always reminds you that underneath it, this is still a lonely teenager improvising his way through adulthood. Leo described the character as someone with, quote, misdirected potential, and I think that comes across. He's clearly intelligent, clearly capable, but he's using all of that in completely the wrong way. And in a strange way, the whole performance becomes kind of meta, because Frank is basically acting his way through the entire film. Leo even joked that he might be one of the best actors ever, and in this context it sort of makes sense. But as I've said previously, compared to the performances higher up on this list, there just isn't quite as much depth or impact here. It's extremely enjoyable, and Leo plays the role brilliantly, but it doesn't quite linger in the same way as the performances higher up on the list. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio's Frank Abagnale Jr. in Catch Me If You Can comes in at number 12, and I'm giving the performance a 7.5 out of 10. At number 11 we have Titanic, which gives us a completely different to the other different kind of Leo performances that we're used to normally seeing, right? At the time, Leo described it as a bit of a gamble. He'd, quote, traditionally done smaller films, and this was a, quote, completely new venture, something on a scale he'd never dealt with before. In fact, he'd even said he tended to avoid these kinds of big, effects-driven films because they could, quote, lack a lot of content. And yet this is the film that made him a global star. What makes this performance interesting isn't just the scale, it's the character. Leo talked about Jack being, quote, open-hearted and, quote, free-spirited, and that playing someone that emotionally available was actually harder than he expected. Not because it's showy, but because there's nowhere to hide. You either believe it or you don't. And here, you definitely believe it. From the moment he appears, there's this youthful, almost naive energy to him, but in a really genuine way. It genuinely feels like Jack just loves being alive. The way he reacts to the ocean, the excitement in small moments, that king of the world feeling. It's all played with complete sincerity. What I like is how consistent the performance is. Jack doesn't suddenly shift into something else. He's always the same guy who just appreciates life. Even when he's bluffing his way through first class, there's a balance to it. He can play the part, but you can still see slightly out of place, like he's aware he doesn't belong there. And that's where the performance becomes more specific. There are small moments that build the character really well, like how quickly he picks up on Rose's situation early on, or the way he adjusts his behaviour depending on who he's around. Even something like the drawing scene, you can tell how focused he is on her, not in a performative way, but because that's genuinely all that matters to him in that moment. The relationship with Kate Winslet is what brings everything together. There's a real sense of discovery in how he looks at her, like he can't quite believe she's there. And importantly, he's not trying to impress her in a typical, movie star sort of way. He just is. There's also an interesting layer from interviews where Leo talked about asking questions like whether the sex scene was Rose and or Jack's first time having sex. Just trying to understand the reality of these moments. And I think that attention to detail from Leo is why this relationship feels so grounded. Then the second half hits, and the performance deepens without ever losing that core. Jack stays the same person, even as everything falls apart. He holds on to that outlook. He keeps Rose calm, reassures her, and focuses entirely on her rather than himself during the scenes of the crash. And that's what makes the ending land. There's a moment where you can see he understands what's coming, not through dialogue, just in his eyes, and even then he doesn't panic. He just accepts it and stays present with her. That final stretch genuinely, it got to me. I'm not going to lie, I did. Maybe. Okay, yeah, I cried. Fine, whatever. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is the fact that this is a longer performance, and naturally that gives you more to work with when you're judging it. You just have more time to notice details, more moments to connect with, so that probably does help it slightly in the rankings compared to something shorter. That being said, I still think it's stronger than something like Catch Me If You Can. That performance is a lot of fun, but this feels more emotionally complete. So with that said, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack Dawson in Titanic an 8 out of 10. And after watching it, I completely understand why this was the performance that made him a global star. Coming in at number 10 is The Departed. And I know this might be a controversial placement because a lot of people absolutely love this performance, but for me, while it's still very strong, it's not quite at the level of some of the roles higher up on this list. And I think part of the reason is that this is a very difficult performance to talk about because almost everything DiCaprio is doing here is internal. Leo plays Billy Costigan, an undercover cop forced to live around violent criminals while constantly trying not to expose himself. And DiCaprio described the character as being in, quote, constant angst and having, quote, 24-hour panic attack. And that description completely tracks with what we see on screen. From the start, Billy just looks exhausted. His eyes are constantly scanning rooms, he's jumpy, on edge, always trying to read people before they read him. There's this constant survival instinct driving the performance. And what I like is that Leo never overplays it. Because Billy is trying to appear tough on the surface, but you can always feel the fear underneath, especially in scenes with Jack Nicholson, where it genuinely feels like he thinks he could die at any moment. Leo actually said the hardest part of the role was figuring out, quote, what do I convey to the audience if I'm surrounded by killers all the time and I have to pretend to be somebody that I'm not? And that tension becomes the entire foundation of the performance. There's also a nice contrast between Billy and Matt Damon's character. Leo described them as, quote, two sides of the same coin. And you can feel that throughout the film. Damon always looks composed and comfortable, while Billy just becomes more and more worn down. Physically, DiCaprio sells that deterioration really well. As the film goes on, he looks rougher, more exhausted, more broken. It genuinely feels like the pressure of the role is destroying him. And because so much of the performance is restrained, the moments where he finally snaps stand out even more, like the scenes with Mark Wahlberg, where all that frustration suddenly comes bursting out.
Hey! Stop it! Break it up! Stop it!
I also think the Boston accent is handled well. It's subtle enough that it never feels distracting, which is impressive considering how easy that accent is to overdo. Compared to something like Blood Diamond from the same year, I actually think this is the more grounded and believable performance, even if it is less flashy. But overall, this is a role that relies more on realism than big acting moments. It never feels flashy, but it always feels believable. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio as Billy Costigan in The Departed is coming in at number 10, and I'm giving the performance an 8 out of 10. Coming in at number 9, we have Revolutionary Road. Now, this is probably the most forgettable film on the entire list for me. It actually ended up being my lowest rated of all the films. I think I gave it like a 5.5. Anyways, to tell you the truth, I can't remember a single thing that happened in this film. But anyways, we're not here to talk about the film, we're here to talk about the acting from my boy Leo. And despite the fact that I really didn't like the film, I still think DiCaprio gives a really strong performance here. This film reunited Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet a decade after Titanic, but Leo said they deliberately wanted to avoid recreating that same dynamic. He described the story instead as the, quote, disintegration of a relationship. Two people desperately trying to hold on to love that's slowly disappearing. And that's exactly what the film feels like. Frank Wheeler, the character that Leo is playing, is one of DiCaprio's most restrained and grounded characters. Leo described Frank as, quote, tragically unheroic, saying that he, quote, does not have the courage to lead the life he wants to. At the start of the film, you can still see ambition and excitement in him, especially with the dreams of escaping to Paris and starting a new life. And for a while, he genuinely feels hopeful again. But slowly, throughout the film, you watch that optimism disappear, and Leo plays that decline really well. There's this constant frustration underneath Frank, like he knows he's becoming trapped in a life he never wanted, but he's too weak or maybe just too afraid to actually change it. A lot of the performance comes through in smaller moments, the awkward silences, the contained anger during arguments, the guilt, the exhaustion. Even in the huge argument scenes with Winslet, it never feels overacted or theatrical. It just feels ugly and real. And the chemistry between DiCaprio and Winslet is definitely the strongest part of the film. Because of their history from Titanic, there's automatically this warmth between them early on, which makes the collapse of the relationship hit harder later. Leo also said the film being shot mostly in sequence was, quote, tremendously helpful because it allowed the actors to slowly discover the characters as the relationship deteriorated, almost like doing a theatre production. And by the final act, Frank just feels emotionally drained. There's a sadness and sincerity to the performance that really carries the film once everything starts falling apart. So while I don't think Revolutionary Road itself is especially memorable, I do think DiCaprio gives one of his most grounded performances of his career. So overall, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio's performance as Frank Wheeler in Revolutionary Road an 8.5 out of 10, and it comes in at number 9 on the list. In 8th place, we have Killers of the Flower Moon, and this might be one of the most frustrating characters that Leo has ever played. Here he's playing Ernest Burkhart, a man who, on the surface, seems simple, almost harmless, but is actually at the centre of something much darker. And what makes the performance work so well is that Leo never plays Ernest as intelligent enough to be a mastermind. He plays him as weak. From the very start, there's this constant confusion behind the eyes. He feels out of his depth, easily influenced, especially by his uncle, played by Robert De Niro. And that dynamic is everything. You can feel that Ernest is scared of him, constantly trying to say the right thing, do the right thing, but never really thinking for himself. Leo even described the story as a, quote, slow burn of manipulation. Ernest getting pulled deeper and deeper into something horrific, and that's exactly what it feels like. Because what's unsettling is he does understand what's happening, but he goes along with it anyway. And that's where the performance really works. There's this constant tension between love and greed. He clearly cares about his wife Molly, but at the same time he's complicit in destroying her family, simply for his greed. And Leo never tries to clean that up or make it easy to watch. He just lets it sit there. Physically, I think this is one of his most interesting performances. He always feels slightly uncomfortable, slouched, hesitant, a bit lost. Even the way he speaks, it's slower, less confident, like he's always trying to catch up with what's going on around him. And as the film goes on, that just gets worse. He becomes more dishevelled, more erratic, and by the end he seems almost addicted to lying, to the point where he believes his own version of events. Leo described the character as someone caught in this, quote, twisted love story. And I think that's the best way to look at it, because you're constantly questioning him. Does he love his wife? Does he understand what he's doing? And you never fully get the answer. And that is exactly what makes it stick. It's not as immediately impressive as some of his bigger performances, but the more you think about it, the more uncomfortable it becomes. So for me, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart in Killers of the Flower Moon an 8.5 out of 10. Coming in at number 7 is J.Edgar. And this is a really interesting one because it's built almost entirely on control. This isn't a flashy performance. Everything DiCaprio does feels tight, deliberate, and held in. Physically, the first thing that stands out with this performance is the stiffness. There's a rigidity to how he moves. His posture is upright. His gestures are precise. And it feels like he's constantly containing himself, like every movement has been calculated. This control also carries straight into the voice. He speaks in a controlled, measured way, clear, direct, almost rehearsed. And when he's in positions of power, he uses it to completely command the room. It's calm, but it has weight. You listen when he talks. But what makes the performance work is that it's not constant, because every now and then, the mask slips. The stammer creeps in, the rhythm shifts, and suddenly that authority disappears. It happens in moments where he's uncomfortable or exposed, and it completely changes how you see him. And that contrast is really what defines the performance. Because this version of Hoover is obsessed with perception, how he's seen, how he's remembered, and DiCaprio builds that into everything. The stiffness, the voice, the restraint, it all feeds into that idea. He even said the biggest challenge was, quote, how do you empathise with this character and understand his motivations? And you can feel that because this isn't a typical protagonist. You're rarely fully on his side. What impressed me most were the smaller behavioural details, especially the way you can see him thinking in real time, trying to maintain control as it starts to slip. And weirdly, the physical restrictions, the prosthetics that he uses to play the older version of the character, the movement work actually help the performance. They add to that rigidity. Overall, this is a very controlled, very specific piece of acting. It's not one of his most dynamic performances, but in terms of detail and character work, it's incredibly precise. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio as J.Edgar Hoover in J.Edgar comes in at number 7 on the list, and I'm giving the performance an 8.5 out of 10. And coming in at our number 6, potentially controversially low, is The Revenant. And this is the one, isn't it? The Oscar. The narrative finally complete for Leonardo DiCaprio. And I get it. I mean, this is probably the most physically demanding performance he's ever given. He throws absolutely everything at this role. Crawling, gasping, freezing, eating raw meat. It's ridiculous levels of commitment. Leo himself said that this was, quote, without a doubt the hardest film I ever had to do. And yeah, you can feel that in every single frame. Because this isn't expressive acting. It's instinct. There's barely any dialogue. And that was something that really interested him. He talked about, quote, pushing a narrative forward without words. And that's exactly what this performance is. Everything comes through physical behaviour. The breathing, the movement, the pain. And what impressed me even more on my rewatch of this film was just how specific the physical acting is. The way Glass struggles to stand, the body language, the constant scanning of his surroundings. You completely believe this is a man surviving minute to minute. And to be fair, it works. There are moments here where he's genuinely brilliant. The stuff with his son especially. He lets the emotions sit, doesn't rush it, and then it hits. It's controlled, it's grounded, and it's probably some of his best acting in the film. But, as you can clearly see, I don't think this is his best performance. Because when I look at what he's actually doing here, a lot of it is endurance. It's suffering. It's pushing himself to the absolute limit physically. And even Leo described Hugh Glass as a, quote, man who has lost absolutely everything and has to explore the will to live. And that's exactly what we're watching for 2.5 hours. But acting-wise, I don't think it's as layered or as engaging as some of his other performances higher up on this list. The performance intentionally stays in a very narrow emotional register for long stretches. And over time, that did lose me a bit. I also found the realism slightly inconsistent. At the start, it feels insanely immersive, like you're actually there.
To the boat! To the boat, sir! Boat!
It's shot in a way that feels almost voyeuristic, like you're witnessing something you shouldn't be seeing. But then there are moments where the survival aspect pushes the limits of believability slightly. But interestingly, on rewatch, I actually found it easier to buy into it than I did the first time. And I think that's because once you understand the rhythm of the film, you stop questioning the reality as much and focus more on the bodily experience of what Glass is going through. You know, you kind of believe that he crawled into the dead horse and got beaten up by the bear, because once you've already seen it and you know what's coming, you can focus on other things rather than sitting there going, oh, well, I don't really know if I believe that he would survive this. And you can just focus on the acting itself. Now, I do think that this is probably his most unique role. He looks completely different, feels completely different, and there's something seriously impressive about how far he pushes himself here. And I respect it massively. But for me, difficulty alone doesn't automatically make it his best. And specifically in that Oscar year, I think the narrative around Leo's career and the lack of strong competition in that category in 2016 really helped his case for winning the Oscar. So overall, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio's performance as Hugh Glass in The Revenant a 9 out of 10, and it comes in at number 6 on the list. And in my opinion, from this point onwards, I genuinely think every single performance left on this list could have won an Oscar in the right year. Coming in at number 5 is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And this is one of DiCaprio's most layered performances because he's basically playing an actor who's falling apart. Leo plays Rick Dalton as someone completely stuck between two versions of himself. He described the character as, quote, holding on to the past, realising he's a Hollywood relic as the 60s come in. And that idea runs through everything. From the start, there's this underlying panic to him. He's jittery, slightly unsure, always overthinking. Whether it's in that meeting with Pacino at the start of the film or on the set of Lancer later on, there's this constant awareness that his relevance is fading. And that's where the performance gets really interesting because a lot of it is internal. Leo talked about building Rick around, quote, self-inflicted torture. And you can feel that. No one is harder on Rick Dalton than Rick Dalton.
I'm gonna blow your fucking brains out tonight. Alright? Your brains are gonna be splattered all over your goddamn pool. I mean it, motherfucker.
Every mistake becomes a spiral. Every setback feels like the end. And the trailer breakdown scene is probably the clearest example of that. It's funny, it's chaotic, but it's also kind of painful. He's not just angry, he's embarrassed. It feels like a man watching his own career fall apart in real time. But what makes it work is the contrast. Because when he's actually acting, when he's playing Caleb, for example, in the Lancer set, he's great. He's confident, he's controlled, he's properly commanding. And Leo even said part of the challenge was figuring out, quote, what kind of actor Rick was and what his potential could have been. And you see it. Rick is talented. That's what makes it so frustrating. There's also loads of smaller details that build the character. The slight stutter when he's nervous, the constant coughing, the way he fidgets or avoids eye contact when he feels judged. It all feeds into that insecurity. And then you get moments like the scene with the child actor where she tells him it's the best acting she's ever seen. And the way Leo plays that, he just lets it land. No overreaction, just quiet pride. It genuinely feels like Rick has been waiting years to hear somebody say that to him. Leo also described the role as a man, quote, dealing with his own mortality as an actor. And that's exactly what it is. This is someone realising he might never be what he thought he'd be. Compared to his Oscar competition that year, Joaquin Phoenix and Joker, Although Phoenix's performance might be bigger and more transformative on the surface, in my opinion, what DiCaprio is doing here is aiming for something much more human. It's more controlled, and in some ways it's more relatable. It's insecurity, ego, and self-doubt played with an incredible level of detail. And that's why I think it works so well. It's not as explosive as some of the performances above it, but in terms of detail, honesty, and character work, it's right up there. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio as Rick Dalton in Once Upon a Time comes in at number 5, and I'm giving the performance a 9 out of 10. At number 4, we have One Battle After Another, and this was a really interesting one for me, especially on a second viewing. I actually watched it again for research at a local film festival, and during the interval I ended up speaking to a film teacher who was attending, who described Leo's performance here as, quote, heightened and extreme, but still completely believable. And I think that's exactly what it is. From the very start, there's this manic, jittery energy to Bob. He's constantly on edge, moving quickly, thinking quickly, reacting to everything around him. And somehow it still feels grounded. It feels like this guy's brain is just running at full speed the entire time.
We're talking about freedom, baby. We're talking about freedom. Freedom's a funny thing, isn't it? When you have it, you don't appreciate it, and when you miss it, it's gone. It's just gone. Poof.
Leo even talked about building the character through loads of prep, spending time in real locations, researching ex-revolutionaries and understanding people who were, quote, haunted with memories and guilt after trying to re-enter normal life. And you can kind of feel that in the performance, like there's something slightly broken underneath all that energy. But what really stood out to me, especially watching it with an audience, is how funny he is in this film. There were loads of scenes like the phone calls, of course, or even just the way he moves that had people properly laughing. And it's hard to explain exactly why, but I think it is in the physicality, the frantic movements, the slightly reckless way he throws himself around. It all feels a bit messy, a bit half put together, and that's what makes it work so well. And unlike something like Catch Me If You Can, where the charm is very clean and controlled, this feels much more unstable and unpredictable. One thing I also found really interesting here is what's driving the character. Because a lot of Leo's performances are built around ambition, money, power, greed. But here it's much more about love. His relationship with his daughter Willa is at the centre of everything, and you really feel that, whether it's the pride he has for her or the way he tries to protect her. There's a warmth here that you don't always see in his performances. But personally, I think he's actually at his best in the first half of the film. That's where he has the most to do. The energy is higher, he's more active, and you get more of that frantic, chaotic side to him. In the second half, as things narrow in and the story becomes more focused, he's still very good, but the performance becomes a bit more reactive, let's say. That being said, he still has some really strong moments later on, especially that, heroic stretch towards the end where he actually manages to find Willa. Leo described that moment as feeling, quote, real and true. And that certainly comes across here. And funnily enough, this performance actually improved for me on a second viewing. On first watch, I had it at an 8.5, but after seeing it again, I bumped it up to a 9. I think I just really appreciated a lot more of the detail, especially in the physicality and those smaller character moments that really make the performance feel lived in, I suppose. So overall, this is a really strong performance, full of nuance, detail, and something unusual for Leo. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio as Bob in One Battle After Another comes in at number 4 on the list, and I'm giving the performance a 9 out of 10. And starting off our top 3 is The Aviator. This was only Leo's second Oscar nomination, but by this point he'd already built a reputation for delivering performances that came very close towards recognition. And here, playing Howard Hughes, it finally felt like he'd arrived as a truly major dramatic actor. Released in 2004 and directed by Martin Scorsese, The Aviator follows Howard Hughes across decades of his life, from ambitious young filmmaker to aviation pioneer to a man slowly being consumed by obsessive-compulsive disorder, otherwise known as OCD. And that's what makes this performance so impressive to me. Leo isn't just playing one version of Howard Hughes, he's playing him across multiple eras of his life, while gradually showing this brilliant, charismatic, confident man lose control of himself piece by piece. DiCaprio described Hughes as, quote, one of the most multi-dimensional, compelling, complex men of the last century, calling him this larger-than-life figure who was simultaneously a visionary filmmaker, a pioneering aviator, and a man completely consumed by obsession and fear. And you can feel all of those sides throughout the performance. At the start of the film, Howard has this incredible aura about him. Leo carries himself with elegance and confidence. The way he walks, the way he talks, the way he controls conversations. He feels like somebody who always gets what they want. And yet underneath that confidence, there's already something slightly uneasy about him. Leo prepared for the role by meeting with doctors who specialise in OCD, and even spent time with someone living with this condition. And what's impressive is how subtle the performance is early on. It begins with the tiniest of behaviours, the hesitation around dirt, the discomfort when someone touches his food, the way he incessantly washes his hands, the little pauses and repeated phrases.
The way of the future. The way of the future. The way of the future. The way of the future.
You can see Howard trying to maintain control over himself before the OCD completely takes over. And I think Leo portrays that progression brilliantly. Because by the second half of the film, Howard becomes almost unrecognisable from the man we met at the beginning. There's this sequence where he isolates himself in the screening room for days, completely shutting himself away from the world, surrounded by milk bottles and jars of urine, repeating phrases to himself over and over again. And Leo plays these scenes in a way that feels genuinely sad more than theatrical. Howard isn't presented as insane in some exaggerated Hollywood caricature. He feels trapped inside his own mind, embarrassed by what he's becoming, but unable to stop it. And physically, Leo completely transforms as the film goes on. Towards the end, he looks exhausted, frail, hollowed out, like the shell of the confident man we saw earlier on. But what keeps the performance from becoming miserable to watch is that Howard never fully loses that charisma underneath it all. And nowhere is that clearer than the courtroom sequence at the end of the film. At first, he seems overwhelmed by the cameras and the attention surrounding him. But the second he starts talking, he completely owns the room. You suddenly remember who Howard Hughes was before the decline. The confidence comes flooding back. The intelligence, the charm, the sheer force of personality. And Leo absolutely dominates those scenes.
You can't subpoena me. You can arrest me, you can even claim that I've folded up and taken a run out, Powder, but, well, I've had just about enough of this nonsense. Good afternoon.
What I also really appreciate about this performance is how much genuine passion Howard has for aviation. Leo described being an aviator in that era as the equivalent of being an astronaut in modern times, this almost mythical, larger-than-life pursuit. And you really feel Hughes' obsession with flying throughout the film. Whether he's designing planes, testing aircraft, or pushing for impossible speeds, Leo makes him feel like someone chasing greatness at all costs. And because of that, the tragedy of the character lands even harder. This is a man capable of extraordinary things, slowly being destroyed by his own mind. Now, in terms of the Oscar race that year, Jamie Foxx of course swept the season for Ray. And having not seen that performance, I can't really argue against that result. But I do think that this Leo performance is the kind of performance that absolutely could have won an Oscar in another year. Because for me, this is one of the most complete performances of DiCaprio's career. It's charismatic, emotionally detailed, physically transformative, and incredibly layered across nearly 3 hours of screen time. So for that reason, I'm giving Leonardo DiCaprio's performance as Howard Hughes in The Aviator a 9.5 out of 10, and I'm placing it at number 3 on the list. Coming in at number 2 is Django Unchained. And this was another one that improved after a rewatch for me. The first time I saw the film, I had the Django performance ranked 3rd overall, but on rewatch it moved up to 2nd, and honestly, I think this might be one of the greatest villain performances of the 21st century. What makes it so striking is how different it is from most DiCaprio performances. Usually, Leo plays characters we're meant to root for. Ambitious people, flawed people, but still ultimately human and sympathetic. Here, he goes in completely the opposite direction. Calvin Candie is cruel, racist, narcissistic, childish, unpredictable, and overall just genuinely rotten. And DiCaprio himself described him as, quote, one of the most narcissistic, self-indulgent, racist, horrible characters I've ever read in my entire life. He also said there was, quote, absolutely nothing about Candie he could relate to, and that playing somebody who viewed black people as lesser was, quote, incredibly disturbing. And I think that discomfort actually helps the performance, because Candie never feels cartoonish, he feels real. There's this horrible, awful authenticity to him that makes him feel like a man who could have really lived in that time. What's also interesting is that this was DiCaprio's first real supporting role since Titanic. He doesn't even appear until over an hour into the film. But the second he does enter the film, the entire energy changes. Tarantino gives him that iconic dramatic zoom-in introduction, and immediately you understand who controls this world. And from there, Leo completely owns every single scene he's in. And what makes this performance so effective isn't just the evilness, it's the personality underneath it. Candie is charismatic, he's playful at times, almost boyish. He likes entertaining people, showing off and being at the centre of attention. And there's even a weird insecurity to him that we see unravel. You see it in those little moments, the way he pauses after a joke expecting laughter, the way he performs for his guests, the way he reacts when someone challenges him. It feels like we're watching somebody constantly trying to prove his intelligence and authority to the people around him. And that's why he becomes so dangerous, because underneath all the charm there's this volatility that can explode at any moment. And the dinner table scene is of course the clearest example of that we get to see in the film. What makes the scene work so well is how controlled he is at the start. He speaks calmly, almost casually, but you can feel the anger under every single line.
And we will again, in a moment.
At this time, he's completely focused in on Django, barely even acknowledging Schultz, and it creates this horrible tension where you know something bad is coming. And then, of course, there's the moment where Candie completely rages and DiCaprio cut his hand on the glass.
Now lay your palms flat on that tabletop. If you lift those palms off that turtle shell tabletop, Mr. Pooch is gonna let loose with both barrels of that sawed off. There have been a lot of lies said around this dinner table here tonight, but that you can believe.
And instead of breaking character and stopping the scene, he just keeps going. You can literally see him recalculating in real time, figuring out how to use the injury inside the scene, and somehow it makes Candie even more unsettling. And by the end of it, he's completely lost control, screaming, bleeding, humiliating Hildy, and it's genuinely uncomfortable to watch.
And beat our ass to death with it, right in front of both y'all!
What's even crazier is that DiCaprio actually struggled with aspects of the role during filming, especially the racist language. There's that famous story where Leo was struggling with the language that he had to use, and Samuel L. Jackson essentially said to him, "This is just another Tuesday for us, motherfucker." And then Leo was committed. And once Leo commits, you would never know he had any hesitation at all. I also think the physical details of the performance are incredible. The accent is great, the posture, the constant grin, the disgusting teeth. Everything about Candie feels decayed. And DiCaprio even described the character as, quote, rotting from the inside. And honestly, that's exactly what comes across on screen. And one thing I would say about this performance is the Oscar conversation about it. That year, the eventual Best Supporting Actor lineup was made up of entirely previous winners. So if DiCaprio had managed to get in over his co-star Christoph Waltz, who actually won the Oscar that year for this film, he would have been the only nominee that year who hadn't already won an Oscar. And honestly, I think he would have and should have won. Because as great as Waltz is in Django, I genuinely don't think he's giving the best supporting performance in this film. For me, it's so clear that DiCaprio is. And by the end of that most recent rewatch, I actually stopped seeing Leo entirely. I was just watching Calvin Candie. And for a performance this entertaining, disturbing, funny, and genuinely threatening to not even receive an Oscar nomination, I think it's one of the biggest acting snubs of his entire career. So for me, Leonardo DiCaprio as Calvin J. Candie in Django Unchained comes in at number 2, and I'm giving this performance my first 10 out of 10. As I'm sure you all predicted from the very start, at number 1 we of course have the Audition. Now I know some of you might not have seen this, honestly, you know, it's a bit of a hidden gem, but honestly I think it's the best film ever to be put to screen. DiCaprio is just unbelievable in this, playing himself of course, but it doesn't even feel like acting. The emotional depth and nuances, you know, it's all adding together in every scene, and it's just, yeah, no, I'm taking the piss. Alright, play the real number 1. So yeah, you all guessed it. Let's talk about The Wolf of Wall Street, shall we? And honestly, I think this might be the performance I've had the most to say about in this entire video. In fact, I genuinely think I could make an entire standalone video purely about Leo's performance here and still not cover everything I want to say about it. Because this isn't just a great performance, this is one of the greatest performances I've ever seen. And having watched Dallas Buyers Club specifically for this video, I can confidently say that I genuinely believe Leonardo DiCaprio should have won the Oscar for Wolf of Wall Street. And I say that with full respect to Matthew McConaughey, because I actually thought his performance in Dallas Buyers Club was outstanding. I even came away from that film thinking that on another day, I could absolutely see myself giving that performance a 10 out of 10 as well. But that's hypothetical. This is reality. And in reality, DiCaprio's performance in The Wolf of Wall Street is already on my personal list of the greatest performances I've ever seen, and it certainly should have won him his first Academy Award. What makes the performance so special to me is the progression of Jordan Belfort throughout the film. Leo doesn't just play Jordan as one consistent character for 3 hours, he plays him in phases. Leo described Jordan as, quote, the dark side of the American dream, and I think that's exactly what makes the performance so fascinating. At the beginning of the film, Jordan feels genuinely naive. Even during the famous lunch scene with the aforementioned Matthew McConaughey, you can see Jordan just absorbing everything around him. At this time, he still thinks Wall Street is about helping clients and making money honestly. And Leo plays this younger version of Jordan so differently to the monster we eventually see later on. Because after Black Monday, everything changes. The posture changes. The voice changes. The confidence changes. Suddenly Jordan walks with swagger. And one thing I absolutely love is how Leo uses physicality throughout this film, especially in the selling scenes. When Jordan is on the phone trying to sell stock, Leo isn't just reading dialogue. He's performing. The hand gestures, the rhythm of his speech, the way he controls the conversation. It's the confidence in his body language. It's like he's hypnotising people almost. And you can physically see the exact moment Jordan knows he's made the sale. And Leo himself talked a lot about the improvisation they used during the process of making this film. He described this process as, quote, organised chaos, and honestly I think that perfectly sums up the performance. Because Jordan constantly feels alive. Nothing about this performance ever feels rehearsed or mechanical. Even the way Jordan interacts with the camera during the voiceovers feels natural and spontaneous. And then, of course, we get into the drug-taking scenes, which are absolutely unbelievable. Because what impresses me most is that Leo never feels like he's overacting during any of them. A lesser actor could have made these scenes feel cartoonish very easily, and yet Leo somehow makes all of it feel very real. For example, when we see Jordan smoke crack for the very first time, the way he exhales and lets the feeling slowly take over his body genuinely feels authentic. It never feels like I'm watching somebody pretending to be high. And then, of course, there's the infamous Quaalude scene, which honestly might be one of the greatest pieces of physical acting I've ever seen. What makes this scene so genius is the timing. Every movement feels delayed by half a second, like Jordan's brain and body have completely disconnected from each other. He completely loses control. The drooling, the crawling, the noises. We see this complete lack of control that Jordan has over his body.
Think, you motherfucker, think. Yes. I got it. I've got it. I can roll. I can roll.
It's hilarious, but it's also ridiculously detailed. And what makes it even crazier is learning how much thought went into it. DiCaprio said Scorsese wanted the scene to feel almost like a dream sequence, and Leo himself even came up with details like opening the car door with his foot once they realised what kind of car they were using for the film, as Scorsese hadn't previously realised. That level of attention to detail is just insane. And the fact that there's barely any sound in huge parts of the sequence makes it even better. All you hear is him groaning, panting and dragging himself across the floor. It's full body acting at the absolute highest level. In my opinion, this scene alone could justify the Oscar. But what elevates the performance beyond just being funny or entertaining is the charisma Jordan has throughout this film. Because Jordan Belfort in this movie isn't just a stockbroker. He's almost a cult leader. And the crazy thing is, Leo literally described him that way in interviews. He talked about Jordan as somebody completely consumed by greed and temptation. A man with, quote, no moral compass, surrounded by, quote, greedy, narcissistic, money-hungry bastards. And you feel that coming through in every single second of the performance, especially during the speech scenes. In said sequences, Jordan winds himself up before speaking almost like a dictator addressing an army. He controls the silence, slowly builds the energy in the room, and then suddenly explodes with charisma. And the scariest part is, you completely understand why people follow him. Even in smaller conversations, Leo constantly plays Jordan like somebody testing people psychologically, figuring out exactly what they want to hear and then becoming that person for them. And both times when watching this film to take notes for this video, I wrote the fact that if I was sitting in that room, listening to Jordan Belfort give those speeches in the way that Leo is giving them, I think I'd probably follow him too. That's how magnetic Leo is here. It almost reminds me of Dutch Van der Linde from Red Dead. Somebody so charismatic and persuasive that people ignore all the obvious warning signs because they're so completely captivated by them. And Leo understands that Jordan's charisma is basically his superpower. There's that one speech in particular where Jordan slowly builds from uncertainty into absolute conviction during the I'm not leaving moment. And that progression in Leo's performance during that scene is almost unbelievable. At first, Jordan almost sounds emotional,
That's not the Kimmy that I met.
then confident,
You know what? I'm not leaving.
then completely euphoric.
I'm not leaving.
I'm not fucking leaving!
And by the end of it, he's basically transformed into a god in the eyes of his Stratton employees. That's the genius of the performance. Leo understands exactly how Jordan manipulates people. But what really pushes this performance into all-timer territory for me is the collapse. Because by the end of the film, Jordan is completely hollow. After the yacht crash, he looks like a complete shell of his former self. After Naomi leaves him, he looks desperate and pathetic. And when he returns to Stratton wearing the wire, trying to act like the old Jordan Belfort, you can see right through him. The confidence is fake now. The aura is gone. And Leo lets you see every bit of that collapse underneath the surface. And that's why the highest compliment I can give this performance is this. Even when Jordan is being ridiculous, even when he's completely off his face, even when the film becomes absolute chaos, it always feels real. And Leo himself talked about wanting the film to feel like, quote, a modern-day fall of the Roman Empire set on Wall Street. And honestly, that's exactly what this performance feels like. For 3 hours, we watched Jordan Belfort go from a nobody to a king to absolutely nobody once again. And every single stage of that journey feels believable, thanks to Leo. So for me, it's simple, really. Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street is a 10 out of 10 performance. One of the greatest performances I've ever seen, and one of the biggest Oscar snubs I know of. And of course, it's coming in at the #1 spot on this list. So after watching all 15 of these performances, and quite a few of them for the very first time, I think I've come away with two main conclusions. The first is that Leonardo DiCaprio's filmography is even stronger than I realised going into this. And second is that consistency might actually be the most impressive thing about his career. Because even the performances that missed out on Oscar nominations still scored incredibly highly for me. If we want to look at some stats, on average the Oscar-nominated performances received an 8.6 out of 10, while the performances that weren't nominated for an Oscar still averaged an 8.3. So the gap in quality honestly wasn't that large. And when I looked at the different decades of his career, the things that surprised me the most were just how strong the 2010s were. Across that decade in particular, his performances averaged a 9.3 out of 10 in my ratings, which is honestly ridiculous. And I think that consistency from Leo is what impressed me the most while making this video. Even in the lower ranked performances, there was usually still something memorable going on. Whether it was in the physicality, the voice work, the emotional commitment, or just the level of effort he put into that role, there was always something to enjoy. And watching him finally win the Oscar after going through this entire journey honestly felt a bit emotional. Seeing him winning for The Revenant after watching everything that came before it, it feels so earned. Especially that moment when Leo says,
Let us not take this planet for granted. I do not take tonight for granted. Thank you so very much.
and whether you agree with my rankings or not, I think one thing becomes very clear whilst making this video. Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the defining actors of his generation. So yeah, that's the ranking. Honestly, it feels really weird to be sort of here at the end of this project. Like, it's literally taken me months watching all these films, writing all these scripts, editing everything. It's harder than it looks, guys, let me tell you. But you know what? I've actually learned more about DiCaprio as an actor, and especially as a person, than I ever thought I'd actually know, which just kind of feels really weird knowing now that the project is done and I'm moving on to new stuff, I guess. You see, this video took me absolutely ages to finish. Just the films alone took like 50 hours to watch through all of them, and obviously I had to rewatch a lot of them as well. So yeah, but I genuinely had like a lot of fun making it. And if you've watched all the way through, then I guess you maybe had a bit of fun watching it, which I extremely appreciate. So yeah, let me know with a like or a comment or something, as long as it's nice. Even if you didn't like the video, you can just pretend you did. So yeah, let me know what your rankings would look like, and if there's any films that you thought he should have been nominated for, like maybe Shutter Island or Inception or Great Gatsby or whatever it is that sort of takes your fancy, I suppose. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, you know, maybe the next video will be about Robert De Niro.
Who knows? It definitely, okay, it's about to know. Anyways, but yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Have a good one.